Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
This week's episode is a live recording of a discussion on free speech held recently at the University of Washington. To allow for the extended discussion, this week we forego our usual quick hits and the foolishness of the week. Please direct complaints about this to James, as we all know how much he hates to receive email. For this discussion, Kristen Gilmer joins us. Kristen is a global health scientist and doctor of public health with a professional background in global public health, international development, and political systems. Kristen has worked for the World Health Organization, Oxford University, World Health Partners, United Nations Population Fund, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Dr. Gilmer earned her doctorate at Harvard University, her master's at Columbia University, and completed field training at Oxford University. A recipient of the International Gorman Humanitarian Award, Kristen has received several global health prizes and was a final nominee for the Albert Schweitzer Award. We're here at the University of Washington discussing free speech. To start us off, you can imagine three models. Completely unfettered speech, think of it as the Wild West of oratory. Completely restricted speech, think of that as Orwell's Newspeak, where our goal is actually to control thought. And then a hybrid, which is basically free speech with a footnote, but not in the case of hate speech, or not in the case of making people uncomfortable, not in the case of marginalizing or spreading misinformation. And so I would imagine that there's pretty much no reasonable person that would advocate the Newspeak model. So our question comes down to this: should speech be completely unfettered, or should we go with a hybrid model? And if the hybrid, under what conditions?
Well, that's a great question. If I knew the answer, I'd be driving a lot nicer car than I do right now. I feel like this is a really interesting time in society. Not only legally are we seeing the ramifications of Section 230 being really kind of contested between major tech companies and a whole slew of parties who are kind of challenging them. We're also learning a lot about how information spreads. And it's a pretty novel science. There's a lot of psychology involved. But one thing I find really interesting is we're not distributing information in town halls or squares. There's not buskers talking about the newest snake oil, the newest medicine to cure some disease that we don't even know what it looks like under a microscope. Social media has really become a place where a lot of people consume content. And same with news, and what makes news, what doesn't make news. I know the FCC has really changed that definition since the 90s, and it's really kind of shaped perceptions about what that means as a consumer and as a person who listens. And as a person who is a public health practitioner, someone who works a lot in infectious diseases, and a person who works a lot with journalists and social media users and nonprofits to really kind of help people prevent their own suffering or demise from some kind of information they see. I don't want to say post, I don't want to out any particular groups. I feel like it's really difficult to have free speech in a place where there is no moderation. And the difference is, I think when people think free speech, they think the First Amendment. And that's not necessarily true. Most of the places I work don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of expression. You can't marry who you want to. You can't publicly wear what you want to, let alone post something on the internet without sanctioned media really kind of checking it out. But we live in a place where you can do that. And I think the difference is we don't have a lot of consequences to those actions. If you can make up any kind of account from any IP address and post whatever you want. I don't think that's a really healthy world, and there are consequences to those actions. I think legally speaking, we've already seen some of the ramifications of that. There's a lot of child porn and revenge porn laws out there. But I also don't think you should be able to tell a 12-year-old on Facebook, or 13 to meet the age requirements, to kill themselves, or have any kind of idea about a curative agent from a really respected person without kind of modifications, or at least someone saying, I'm not necessarily that's true. And the reasons for that are the outcomes are so dire. We're talking about death and suffering. In fact, one of the bleach and alcohol cleansers that was recommended on Facebook has impacted over 350,000 people. 900 died within the first 2 months that this was touted, January through March of 2020. So imagine the history of things like vaccines, where smallpox would kill 300 million people without this kind of information. So having this really giant platform and having self-responsibility, I think, are really intrinsic to each other, but not necessarily without moderation.
I'm probably as close as you can imagine to a free speech absolutist. I don't think I could legitimately call myself that. Even I can identify all kinds of things that I would at least say are problematic and that I would have to think through. It's not that hard to say, well, no, careful. I can, in fact, imagine a world in which there is no moderation. And I'm really, in a lot of ways, okay with that. Well, I don't want to start with the worst case scenario. I want to start with something more ridiculous, right? I flip on Facebook when I live in Utah, and I lived there up until about 6 years ago. And what do I see there? Locals advertising their foot mapping services, right? And anybody who looks into this knows that this is bunk of the highest order, right? You learn nothing from a foot map, nor do you treat major diseases this way. And I think even the people who did it, I think, would admit that in their more charitable moments. And yet here they are doing this in public, right? Trotting this out. Now there's all kinds of problems here. They're clearly engaging in commercial activity. They clearly don't have the scientific know-how that they claim to have, right? This is nonsense on a good day. All right, so what do we do about that becomes the question, right? Do you want to clamp down with prior restraint on certain kinds of speech? And all right, we can all be made uncomfortable enough. I can construct a thought experiment where almost everybody, except I think the craziest person, would say, okay, stop it. Usually involving children and pornography, right? This is where you go if you really want to push people to think that maybe we should clamp down on these sorts of things. All right, but most things fall way short of that. And I'm not in the world where everything is binary, right? I don't live in a world where I say, this is perfect and nothing else is any good at all. I live in the world of better and worse. And there are all kinds of things, almost all human things, that I would kind of throw my hands up and say, you know what, this is silly, and I don't really understand why anybody would say these stupid things. But if they're going to say them, knock yourself out. Because there is a moderating factor, and it's the opinions of the rest of us. We've been reticent to share our honest opinions with each other in recent years, right? We don't look each other in the eye anymore and say, wow, that's remarkably stupid. You shouldn't believe that at all for the following reasons. And I think the giving of reasons is something that we're missing, and we should get back to it. I think the shame of idiotic things should be a thing, and we've lost that to some degree, and I think we're all worse off for it. Not only that, but I think people who are shamed for idiotic things sometimes turn out to be right. And having that discussion, instead of just having everybody go radio silent when something a little provocative is put on the table, I think we're all worse off for it.
I hear what you're saying, but I heard Kristen saying something different, because you're talking about idiotic speech. I heard Kristen talking about speech that actually can cause death. So I get on there and say, drink bleach, it's going to cure cancer.
Where do you draw the line? And there's going to be a continuum between these two things. And at some point, even I will say, okay, too much. And I've identified myself as probably the free speech absolutist of the three of us anyway.
Kristen, you said something at the beginning that seems to me to solve the whole problem. You said there are no consequences to harmful speech. So why not just go there and say, fine, you want to advise people to drink bleach because it cures cancer, you go for it. But when somebody dies, we're going to hold you responsible.
Well, we would hold the doctor responsible for that.
Yeah, but we also hold people responsible for practicing medicine without a license. Why wouldn't that kind of speech fall under that law?
That's a great question, one I don't have the answer to, which you will be hearing a lot today.
We specialize in giving that answer too, and I think that's a legitimate answer. But really, the ultimate question here, if you unpack any free speech issue, and there are a lot of them, is it's never should we have free speech or not, it's at what point does it become so damaging that we have to think twice about it. My knee-jerk reaction is it always has to be so much worse than people think right now.
I think that's a very realistic interpretation.
I get answers all the time that go immediately to hate speech. My answer is always the same. What the hell is hate speech? And it always turns out to be something that hurts somebody else's feelings. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a sufficient bar. Boy, you'd have to shut everybody up right now if that were the standard we were going to use. There was a case back in 1978 in Skokie, Illinois, where the National Socialist Association, Nazis, American Nazis, hung up swastikas. And look, this is 1978. The Holocaust is in living memory, right? So it's not like now where it's almost impossible to find a Holocaust survivor. They were everywhere. And this was a town in which there were a preponderance of Jewish survivors. And the Supreme Court said, actually, this is not fighting words, which kind of what we would think of when we think of hate speech, right? What's the standard we should use? And the Supreme Court has said for years that if it causes people to blindly lose their minds and start fighting, that's what we have to limit. Now, I don't know if I agree with that or not, but at least I get it, I understand. And they said that swastikas in Skokie, Illinois don't constitute fighting words. And if that's true, almost nothing does. Am I comfortable with that becomes the question. And I think for all of the difficulties that that brings to our lives, I think I'm really okay with that. What does that tell us about where you started, right? Where we want to talk about literal harm, not some kind of metaphorical harm, not some kind of psychological harm, but actual bleach in the veins harm.
Medical misinformation, and I say that with a very large umbrella. People consider it quackery. People consider this, there's a few different ranges. Actually, misinformation is unintentionally misleading. Disinformation is intentionally misleading and sometimes can lead to profit. And we call something mid-information, where it kind of falls somewhere in between. I love that you were talking about doctors and who has a license and who doesn't, because some of the biggest misinformation comes from medical doctors.
From medical doctors?
I'm talking about the TV doctors. Talking about...
Right. Could I say Dr. Oz out loud?
You can say Dr. Oz out
right?
loud. I went to his grad school and sat in lectures, and the amount of rejection students had at some of the basic biological lessons he taught had to do with his presentation and what he says and the cures that he peddles and things that he says on national media. And that's a way, I think, to really make himself a name, but also to incur profits. When it comes to information, I think there's one bar that has been set in a few ways, which is, does it cause harm to me? Does it cause harm to someone else? That's also familiar, if anybody here has been in social work, the duty to warn principle, which is if you talk about hurting or killing someone or abuse of a child or sexual abuse, you have to report it. And so that kind of gave us the principle a little bit, in my eyes anyway, for misinformation medically and how to fight that. What I found was really interesting was there's a study led by the Max Planck Institute that talked about 4 different topics. They surveyed 2,500 Americans, and some of these were foreign universities, but they did a really great job sampling and making sure that everyone there was pretty varied. The sample itself was randomized quite well from the study reports that I've read. And they looked at a number of topics, 4 major ones: misinformation related to vaccines, democratic elections, the Holocaust, and climate change. And 66% of people would have removed the offending post from social media, which I think sets a bar that is higher than I thought it would be. More than half of people across political spectrums would have removed that. 78% would have taken some action against that account. The things that really counted were, was it a repeat offense? How severe is it? What's the topic? People tended to care much more about things like elections and health than they did about more kind of social justice concerned issues. And for me, that really set an interesting new standard in what this looks like. Because when we're talking about where is that line, apparently if it can harm people, harm a democracy, harm someone psychologically, and not just bleach into the veins, which hasn't been sold that way, it was sold as a mineral silver compound. I think that really gives us an idea of where people stand.
But who gets to decide? This is always the question, right?
Great question.
And I'm going to toss aside the ones that I think everybody would likely agree on and zero in on elections, because we got this business in the wake of the last election, and Fox News just paid a very, very heavy price for pushing out a lot of information that was of very dubious quality, right? This idea that the election was stolen. Can you find evidence to really prove that assertion? No, actually you can't. Can you find evidence that people accept as proving that assertion? You absolutely can. Do people get to just say whatever the hell they want? Do we hold them to a standard? Do I care that 60-something% of the American people would shut that down? I don't know that I do, and I don't know that they have the right to shut it down. I think you're going to be able to say whatever you want. Now, at some point, facts matter. as Fox finds out and Tucker Carlson very specifically finds out. All right, is that the way it should have played out? I don't know, but maybe, given the things that were said and where the preponderance of the evidence lies. You'll never be able to tell a number of people who I know, typically older people now in their 80s, 70s, and 80s, that election result was actually legitimate. You hear it enough from the only news source that you listen to, and before you know it, that's the only version of the truth that there will ever be in your brain. And I don't expect people to go and bone up on election law or become a political scientist studying the election results and things like this. So it leaves us in a bit of a morass. Do a lot of people want these things to be off the table? Well, of course they do. But I don't want any of those same people deciding what I'm allowed to say. Frankly, I don't want to decide what they're allowed to say either. And Ant and I bump into this often, I would say at this point. We run a Facebook group for the podcast. Those of you listening out there should go ahead and join Words and Numbers Backstage. But it's a place where you can come and discuss things reasonably, right? Without the vitriol, without craziness. And, you know, if you involve yourself in the giving of reasons and the making of a proper argument, we're going to hear you out. And people can disagree without getting kicked out. Okay, where do we draw that line? We tend to say it has to be civil, but we also say it can't be lunacy.
Right.
If people say that pixie dust cures AIDS, you're out. And that's an easy one, but there are all kinds of things that are not easy at all.
But there's a big difference there because that's a private setting. We own that.
No, that's
and so
right.
We have the right. It's very
I'm not
different.
saying I don't have the right. I'm saying that as an example, it makes me profoundly uncomfortable to exercise that.
Right. I want to go back to your example of the election being stolen, that being misinformation. People will point to that and say, look, Fox was spreading this misinformation, the problems that we have because you have a bunch of people who believe the election was stolen. And I actually point to it in the other direction. It's an example of more speech solving the problem. What's happened is Fox had to, in your words, pay the consequences to the tune of $750 million.
Yeah, I don't think that this has actually solved much, though.
Oh,
look, I think it solves something.
No,
don't get me wrong.
But let me go the
Don't
other
get me wrong.
direction. Had we by fiat squelched that and said to Fox early on, you cannot say this about the election being stolen, there would have been a continual group of people in the background who believed that there was truth to this, more so than do now. Now, there's always the crazies who are going to believe it regardless.
That's the open question,
But I
right?
claim there's a big chunk of people who look at this and say, wow, if Fox was willing to settle out of court, it means that they knew they could not stand on the facts before a jury. Therefore, what they're saying must have been false.
I think that's a reasonable interpretation. A lot of people didn't, of course, and then they see it as part of a broader conspiracy. We've been at this conspiracy level for a long time with any number of different things. And it gets a little tiring after a while. And I understand why people want to shut people who they disagree with down, but that's just it, right? That's exactly who you should never shut down.
Let's talk for a moment about your example of misinformation in health, things that will kill people. I share James' concern. Who decides what's misinformation? It's very easy to sit here and say, yeah, if this thing is false, it shouldn't be repeated. That's assuming that we all agree it's false. And when it comes to healthcare, I know there are all sorts of things that now have moved into the realm of accepted medicine that were once upon a time home remedies and considered by the health professionals to be nonsense.
And the other way around as well.
Oh, and the other way around. But had we squelched that speech under the banner of, look, this is a home remedy you're pushing, this has no scientific validity, you can't talk about it, it would never have made its way in. It turns out they were right.
I get very, very concerned when anybody gets to decide what other people are allowed to say. And I don't know what level of expertise we can point to. I don't know who we can say, yes, this person will be the grand poobah of this thing. And I just point to Anthony Fauci, right, who was all things to all people COVID, admitted to lying about it. That's really not so great. And what's the rejoinder? It was a noble lie to get them to do the right thing. Yeah, hard pass from me. People get to hear the truth. And what are we going to do? Say you can't criticize him? That you can't point out the obvious flaw when he admits to lying? We can't make an issue of that? I think you kind of have to.
Well, I think there's a big spectrum here. And like you're saying, this all falls within a spectrum. Extreme to pretty lax. And I think one of the things to remember is intentionality. This impacts a lot of my life, and it's something I think about cognizantly all the time. And I think there are instances when people are misknowing and aren't quite aware of exactly what the ramifications are behind a study. Translating that can be really, really difficult. Misinterpreting that, we see it in headlines every single day. That's part of my volunteer work, is interpreting what that means, explaining what a p-value is, what sensitivity and specificity are. But when it comes to really kind of determining that, we always say it's between a person and their physician. I have a huge respect for them, work hand in hand with physicians daily. But who determines the truth is extremely difficult, because science, as we know, is theoretical, and it's constantly changing, constantly evolving.
It's never actually settled, right? That's the thing that pisses me off the most.
It's
the
hard.
Science is settled. No, it's never settled.
There's a few things that can be proven. We know that if you strike a match, most of the time, it'll cause fire, right? We know what chemical reactions are. We know what the chemical components of certain organic compounds are. That's great. Those are all set. But there are some pretty big revolutions that happened within the history of medicine and public health that kind of are a testament to the point that you made, which is they were antibiotics, antiseptics, immunizations, and anesthesias. So some things like anesthesia, people loved when it came out. They thought, oh, this is great. I'm not feeling pain. I don't have to take opium or heroin for my toothache, which happened a lot. I can now be knocked out in this procedure. If you cut my leg off, I'm not going to die of a heart attack because I'm in such extreme pain. But when things like antibiotics came out, when Holmes, and same with the anti-sepsis argument, were happening and babies were dying of septic shock and basically blood infections, he said, this compound can help stop it. I think this has to do with people not washing their hands. And for 40, 50 years, people just laughed it off. And said, what are you talking about? But the intention was to say, okay, this has worked for hundreds of years. We have delivered babies. Babies have survived. Let's keep using that. And so I think it's important to remember that this isn't people intentionally misleading others or challenging for the sake of challenging. It's because that's kind of conventional knowledge and social knowledge. The funny thing is antibiotics really changed the game, because infectious diseases were such a big killer of a ton of people. But that led to the direct consequence of people being mad that viruses weren't treatable by antibiotics. And so suddenly you had this miracle cure that everybody was so excited about, but then it suddenly stopped working for things we thought it would, which was never the point. We always knew it wasn't going to work against viruses, but conventional knowledge told us this stopped it. And so it caused a whole other wave of what now people consider vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaxxers against antibiotics. If we kind of just looked at the basic science, we'd understand that, but that's not how society or misinformation spread works.
Look, vaccines are one of the greatest things that the human mind has ever developed. It's amazing the things that have happened as a result of vaccines, right? So let's go to something more asinine. Anything involving the phrase weight loss.
Well,
You go on YouTube and type those two words in, and you're going to be lied to within seconds. Weight loss. Anything you look at, somebody's selling something that, trust me, isn't going to work unless they're selling the idea that you should eat less and exercise more, right? It's always a product of some kind. So I think we can kind of conclude that this isn't going to work. And yet it brings you to the Dr. Oz idea before, right, where he's got his own axe to grind and he's making a living doing certain things that seem to be quite counterproductive. Would I shut those people down? I wouldn't. Do I know they're lying? I think I do. Notice my phrasing. I think I do. Matter of fact, I'm almost positive. And yet somebody's going to sooner or later develop something that works, and I'm going to say it's more quackery, and I'm going to be wrong. At some point, you know that's going to happen. Actually, it seems to be happening right now with diabetic medications. All of a sudden, people started getting really thin when they took these things.
yeah, speaking of weight loss, people used to use tapeworms for weight loss. It was medically well known. That was the way to go. And it's also the same as things like constipation and emetics.
Would you shut these people down? Not with the tapeworm, because that literally does work. Probably not the way you want. But it does work. You will lose weight if you get a tapeworm.
What forum?
And there you go, right? Look how complicated it is.
Oh, yeah.
Before you even start answering the question, you want qualifiers. And of course, I can't give them. And look, foot mapping on Facebook. I mean, is that where we are? I get almost all of my information from social media one way or another. People who I trust put links up, I click on them, and I think, wow, that's interesting. Other people out themselves as lunatics or racists, so I tell them off and then get rid of them.
But that's not squelching free speech.
It isn't, and with the racists, the question becomes quite pressing. they're more offensive than everybody else. Would I take away their ability to be racist in public? I don't think I would.
That's a great question, though, because to me, the forum is really important. I remember, we were just talking about Tucson, University of Arizona, walking down to a class, and there was we call him a demonstrator. He's a man named Brother Jed.
Oh, I think he's been there ever since you left.
Oh, well, he's never left. We're not great fans of each other, and I'm pretty proud of that. It's the Winston Churchill quote about, oh, you've made enemies. Good, you've stood up for something at some point in your life. Not that I'm a huge Churchill fan, but I was walking to class. I was wearing a tank top, as it is in Tucson, 110 degrees in August. And he just started yelling that how I was going to, basically, to hell. I remember campus police were there, and they asked me, are you comfortable? Are you okay? And I was laughing at the guy and said, I'm fine. I don't know if a lot of other people would be.
Well, some people should grow a thicker skin.
Yeah, but should you, at a place that you pay tuition, be subjected to literal harassment?
Maybe because he paid the taxes to subsidize your education. You know, there's a lot of this underneath the surface. I was at an event on campus at the University of Arizona a couple of days ago for the Center for American Culture and Ideas, a group I work with. And it was a celebration of Israel at 75. There was a gigantic, as you might well imagine, protest right outside. I actually thought that was great. People were well behaved and they showed up with their signs and they were making very strenuous points that I think would have been challenging to address. And they were respectful enough that they didn't try to disrupt the event. They were trying to exercise their rights, which I could really get behind. I wanted them to exercise their rights, even though I was inside at the event. And I thought there was something remarkably healthy about that. There were a couple of cops there, largely because there was another event that seemed to conflict, and people were ready for it to be worse than it was. But things went pretty well, actually. That live and let live mentality is something we've been missing. It bothers me that we can't just leave people be to do whatever crazy thing they do.
But at what point do those actions become consequential to others?
I don't know. It's way past you being called on the quad. But it's before encouraging a 13-year-old to commit suicide literally for any reason at all. We've seen that. So somewhere in between these things, and of course I cheat way towards the other side on this as a free speech guy. I'm with Ant on this one. I think that the cure for most speech issues is more speech.
But notice the two of you have raised two examples on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Of, in your case, someone has hurt my feelings, and in your case, somebody's dying. To your opinion that maybe speech should be controlled if people are going to die. I don't think I buy it, but I'm much more sympathetic to it. Here's what greatly concerns me. If people were to buy that argument that we can control speech when someone's life is in the balance, what do we do after medicine? Because the next obvious thing is public policy. Because economists will tell you that raising the minimum wage is going to cause unemployment amongst the least skilled workers. And that's going to cause real harm to them. In some cases, it's going to cause death. If we're going to control speech in the realm of medicine because people might die, why don't we also control it in the realm of public policy when those public policies can cause death?
It's a great question, but also a point I want to make is a very recent study, I believe it was in JAMA, maybe New England Journal, but it just came out and said that the fourth leading cause of death is poverty. As a social determinant of health, it was heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and then that. So to your point, it definitely bleeds into that. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns about when misinformation influences policy and can have detrimental effects to individuals. A colleague of mine, Jenna Sherman, was just on, I think, PBS NewsHour a couple days ago. And she was talking about how there is currently a lot of misinformation about mifepristone and other drugs that are used both in abortions, but also diabetes and controlling hormones and things like that. And it has already made its way into the judge's order. There were 20 cases at least of misinformation or inaccurate information that he found specifically about these drugs. It's already made its way there. I don't know who's in charge of regulation for this. I think SCOTUS is going to have a really interesting set of outcomes come June. But I do think those types of decisions that impact the lives of many are ones that we have to be very cognizant of, and as practitioners and legislators have to be extremely aware of. When it comes to what's next, medicine or policy, Again, I don't know, but I do know that the line impacts human health is a strong one. And to the Brother Jed comment, the amount of women who have attempted suicide or completed suicide has increased exponentially over the last 10 years due to what we call slut shaming. So while it may be hurting my feelings, it could lead to suicidality for someone else.
If swastikas in Skokie, Illinois doesn't rise to the level, and I don't think it does, right? I think the Supreme Court got it right. Does that make me incredibly uncomfortable? You bet. I don't like swastikas at all. And yet, would I allow them? Absolutely. Is that going to cause people discomfort? Are they going to be upset? Are their feelings going to be hurt? Are they maybe going to become despondent? And maybe yes to all of those things, and that's just how it's going to have to be. Freedom brings with it cost, and this is one of the costs. And one of our big problems is that we want the freedom and we don't want to pay the cost. And these two things, there will be a tension between them all the time. The freer you are, the more trouble you're going to have around the edges. So how much trouble are you willing to put up with? There's the question. Because you're going to get it, or you won't be free.
What I hear Kristen saying is that, at least in the realm of healthcare, it's worth the cost.
Maybe.
My problem is, I don't think it ends there. I think it's a monthly subscription that we buy into.
Oh,
and before you know it.
I think that's right. You think about the abortion debate, which you brought up a moment ago. There were rules all over the place that said, okay, no more abortions, unless it's the life of the mother at stake. You found that that got interpreted very, very broadly in some places and very narrowly in others. The more you study abortion as an issue across the United States, you realize there's never really been a singular attitude about it. We think we're highly polarized now. No different now. But there were places in the country where the standard became, will this lead to any sort possibly of psychological harm to the mother? If they answered yes, life of the mother. No legislator intended that. And yet we know that that's the way these things become interpreted over time. Well, if you see it, you're going to keep seeing it. And the question has to be, how much of it are you comfortable with?
And how interesting that this has become a problem precisely because you reminded me of the amendment, and I've forgotten it, whichever amendment it is that applied the Bill of Rights to the states.
It wasn't an amendment at all, just the Supreme Court decision.
The Supreme Court, excuse me, applying the Bill of Rights to the states.
You can say it's the 14th Amendment. I think that does a lot of damage to a lot of things.
But if it weren't for that, we'd say, fine, leave it up, and you've got 50 experiments.
That's right.
Some of them will get it right, some of them will get it wrong. But we can't do that. We're looking for a wall-to-wall solution here.
Within the states, you'd get that same answer from a lot of them.
Yeah.
From Texas and Utah, probably not so much, right? But from a number of other, Arizona, my state, which is very, very purple, very pluralistic at this point, different ideas in different geographic locations.
For something that's as squishy as this feels, it seems that what we need is to try a bunch of things and see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Every partisan on every side of every issue wants to be able to win in one fell swoop.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the statistic you quoted earlier, something about 66% of people would control
It would take a post down that was inaccurate.
Yeah, and what interested me as you were mentioning that is I wonder if that's an aggregation bias. I don't know that it is, I haven't looked at the numbers, but if you took people on the left who generally said, yes, I'm for free speech, except in the following cases, ABC. And people on the right who said, yes, I'm for free speech, except in the following cases, DEF. And then you put them together and you have, well, 2/3 of Americans are against free speech in all of these categories.
What I found really unique about that is that when it came to political polarization, Republicans were much less likely to want to take any action. Democrats or people who align that way were more likely to do so. But this was across the board, and in terms of aggregation bias, they didn't find any, and it's been peer-reviewed several times. But one of the things I found really interesting is it didn't have to do with the political actions or profile of the person they looked at. It just had to do with the post itself, which I thought was very unique and surprising, frankly. And also I wanted to point out, abortion isn't as isolating as possible. About 70% of the country in polls, and yes, polls are extremely flawed, show support for it. So it is, I think, something...
Depends on how you ask the question.
Certainly.
I was at UConn and the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research was there. And the guy who ran it, a guy named Everett Ladd, said, what do you want the answer to be? Because it's 60%, but it's 60% either for or against, depending on how we word it. And I think there's a preponderance of the evidence now, especially when you see Republicans getting very squishy about this issue, right? When it comes time that they've gotten their way, all of a sudden they're not sure they wanted that. And you see them backing off on the rhetoric a lot. So something's going on. I see a clear and obvious change in the electorate to some degree. To what degree, I'm not so sure.
Well, I operate under the umbrella of the World Health Organization and United Nations, which is almost entirely guided by human rights. And under that kind of doctrine is the support for reproductive rights for women. And so for me, it's a much clearer issue.
And look at what you just said, for me.
Everything I am saying is on my behalf and things that I speak of. They're not representing any group I work for or anything I do. But there is a spectrum of what content moderation looks like in terms of would you remove it, would you not. I'm not speaking anything about swastikas or racism because I'm not an expert on any of that. Obviously, those are absolutely disgusting and vile. What I do speak about is public health. This is my field and my passion. And I think there's a big difference between kicking off an entire account or flagging a post, basically saying, hey, we think this might not be true. And I don't think there is a lot of harm in letting people know that the most up-to-date science and people that I train and people who ask me questions and say, what does this study mean? What exactly is hydroxyquinone? What does this do? What exactly does this do? I think there's a big difference in that than completely censoring and stopping speech. And there is a middle ground, but who is in charge of it? Is this Congress? Is this FCC? Is it social media groups? Those are private entities. Do they have to respond to stakeholders? None of these things I have the answer to, but I do think there's an easy way to prevent any kind of human suffering or death. And if it's through making sure people know that accurate information is out there, then I am all about that. I'm fine with taking a person who says, to give a crazy example again, insert this type of poison into your blood. It can easily kill the bacteria inside you.
Technically true, probably, right?
Yeah, but that's the root of a lot of health misinformation is when it came to things like constipation and nausea, you felt like this really kind of crazy, sick thing was an impending sign of disease. So of course people were talking about laxatives and emetics. Yes, vomit it out, diarrhea it out, get it out. That makes a lot of sense to me, holistically speaking. In fact, when people are ill and they throw up, oftentimes they say, I feel a lot better. So all of these things where when people started to feel ill, that they tried to purge and taking things like mercury or opium to do so, that makes sense to me. And so I don't think there's a lot of bad intentions with most of these people. They're not trying to profiteer off of it. But I do think saying, you know what, throwing up could also lead to a lot of dehydration issues. It could lead to potential organ failure, cardiac arrest. Maybe that's something we should flag. I don't really feel like that is censorship. I feel like that's a way of letting people know that there is an alternative opinion, especially from people they may trust on the internet. I've had my own family members block me. I'm a little proud of that too, mainly because this is something I've devoted my life to. I've spent many, many years both in the field and in the lab working on this. And if they say, no, I'm certain this works, and I say, please don't take that, this could very much hurt you, and they decide to negate that despite me trying to be kind in the approach, so be it.
Yeah, and what you're describing falls much more in the camp I advocate of more speech.
You know, the CEO of PEN America had this great book called Dare to Speak a couple of years ago, and she said she didn't just think it was louder speech or more speech, that it had to do with counter speech and really kind of taking a specific trajectory in which to do that. And there are methods that we've studied psychologically that help us really kind of distribute information in ways that are both accessible and, most importantly, with humility. I think the worst thing you can do is take an elitist stance and say, why would you think this? Just like vomiting and constipation, yeah, it would make sense. Get it out.
But look at what we end up doing, right? Whenever I'm on Facebook and I see the fact check, it only comes from the progressive left. Every fact check is a progressive leftist point of view. I'm willing to say, look, that's probably going to be right, but why is that always the perspective by which we judge? And that just seems to me to reek to high heaven.
But you just said the words point of view, which I think is a pretty interesting component to add to this discussion when we're talking about science. Because there are things that have been proven and disproven, especially like the efficaciousness of things like vaccines, which is one of the, people always go to the most extreme when we're talking about censorship, like banning books, burning books. Same with the vaccines. It's like the hotbed of instant discussion and instant controversy. But we have things that are proven that have had millions and millions of people with numbers out. And so the things that I have to reflect on, and when I'm asked questions, I say, here is the link. We don't know how strong this is, or we do. This has been proven, this hasn't. So far, what we know is, and it's all about the language, the approach that you take in recognizing that.
And that's not the algorithm that Facebook uses, right? There's no human component here except in deciding what the algorithm is going to be. And if you joined our group, you'd see this happen, I think, on a daily basis, where something comes up as the obvious counterexample truth. You have to read this, and you read it, and it's lunacy. I want to give you the last word, but I would like to see something that looks a lot more honest in the counterexamples. And I'd be fine getting counterexamples if they were kind of a smattering around it. And look, there are some things that I don't think we need to discuss anymore. Do I think that we really need to revisit the moral foundations of slavery in the United States? No, actually, I don't. I think that's a dead letter, thank God in heaven, right? And I think there are others. They're less obvious than that, but there are others that are very high on that list that I think rational people would look at. Do we have to talk about gender equality anymore? Well, no, not as such. Ramifications, how you play it out, what it means in practice maybe. But the idea that the genders are equal, do any reasonable people really disagree with that? There are things that I think we've decided collectively and probably for the best, but that list is way shorter than people seem to think. We always end up with the same perspective all the time. And Antony and I are weird people politically, right? Where if you look at things from a financial, a budgetary, a fiscal point of view, we look like arch conservatives. But if you look at things from a social perspective, we look like absolute progressives. As a result, we don't have any friends anywhere. You'd think we would have friends half and half, but we don't. We don't have any friends anywhere.
I'm routinely called a communist and a fascist all the same day.
On the same day.
Great.
That's right. It happens literally the same day. I would like to see a lot more tolerance of dissenting views.
I think what we're also talking about is engaging in civil dialogue, though, which, as we know from the internet, and the very wise poet Drake once said, they don't be the same offline.
But we just did it here.
We did do it here.
It wasn't hard, actually. You seem very nice, even though you hold all kinds of crazy perspectives.
It's fine. You can say science is crazy. It's fine with me.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that.
See how easy this is?
Yeah, but I think a couple of the things that we have to point out are most people don't have bad intentions. There are trolls on the internet. Basic human psychology is going to waver towards what they know at the time from social and conventional knowledge. Even in the Qin dynasty, an emperor in, I think, 221 BC was trying to find a salve for immortality. And he took mercury because the people around him as alchemists were saying, do this. No surprise, by the way, that emperor died of mercury poisoning. 2,000 years later, Abraham Lincoln started to take these things called blue mass, these blue pills. What was in them? Mercury, as well as things like licorice roots. But did we learn 2,000 years later? No. Did he stop taking them because they actually made him feel worse? Yes. But using this kind of conventional knowledge that we've learned over time is hard. It's really, really hard to distinguish from what is out there, especially from people you trust, like family members. I am a person who very much supports the idea of making sure content can be moderated with what we know, or at least questioned. I don't think people are always engaging in civil dialogue with the best intentions. I get people who tell me mean things all the time. In fact, I'm not very active on my social media accounts because I have so many people tagging me to kind of tag team me to come in arguments. Say, can you science them up? Can you use some political rhetoric here? I frankly want to help, but I also recognize if people are not going to associate facts with behavior, there's not a lot I can do in that middle ground to really influence opinions. I will certainly try. But I do think the impacts of misinformation, especially when it comes to health, are hurting the most vulnerable. The people who tend to have the lowest education levels, live the farthest from healthy food because they're in food deserts, have the hardest time accessing education, high-paying jobs, insurance. And so is this a way of using public health and policy as a means of protection against things that can literally have negative influences on people in their life? And to talk about the Holocaust, that generational trauma lasts. But I do think we have a responsibility as people who focus on this field, focus on psychology, communications, the dynamics of digital media, to really make sure people are aware of what they are digesting and that there may be an alternative viewpoint. Civil dialogue is incredible and necessary to facilitate a robust and effective government, especially a democracy. It doesn't happen everywhere. It's what makes me value free speech so much because a lot of the places I work don't have it. But with that being said, if we just let misinformation run rampant, we also risk losing people to suffering and pain they may not know any better than to follow.
That's superb. Thank you.
Thank you,
Kristen.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.